Hey everybody, today's topic is God is not good. And today we're actually going to do something a little bit different, which is I'm actually going to look at a video and react to it. And I have here a clip of John Lennox. And I'll admit, if I were to debate him in person, I'll probably be obliterated. But that doesn't mean I'm going to pull any punches either. And I am going to have to edit down the clips that I have just for the sake of time. But I'm going to try to be as accurately representative of their points as I can possibly be. If you think that I am misrepresenting his points or if I misunderstood something, if you just want to argue with me on his behalf, you're free to do that in the comments. I have been answering every single comment on every single one of my videos. So if you comment down on this video, there's a very good chance that I'm going to respond to it.
The hardest question any of us face, first of all, that there are two kinds of suffering. There's moral evil, the bad things people do to one another. And there's pain, cancers, tsunamis, earthquakes, and so on, that we don't immediately blame other people on.
I really appreciate him for actually making that distinction right off the bat, because so many Christians actually go there and saying that, oh, it's just because of free will. God wants to protect free will, and that's why there's evil, because there's people who are abusing that free will to do evil stuff. But what about like tsunamis and, like he said, earthquakes, and that doesn't really hold. So yeah, I'm glad that he's just clearing that up.
I understand people that become atheists because of suffering, but the atheist route has problems. Because if you say, well, that's just how the world is, Richard Dawkins does this, the world's just what you'd expect it to be. If at bottom there's no good, no evil, no justice, DNA just is, and we dance to its music. That's his view. But half a minute, if there's no good and no evil, why are you talking about the problem of evil and pain?
Okay, so this is actually where a lot of the Christians go also when faced with the question of evil. I don't buy that really. Like that, I don't think that's a great argument, because no, you're right. I'm not the one claiming that there is objective evil and there's an objectively all good, all powerful God. I'm saying, how can you say there is an all powerful, all good God when you have just said that there is objective evil in the world? Like, how can those two things that you just said be both true at the same time?
Where do you get the concept of good and evil from?
From you. From Christians that claim that there is such a thing as objective evil and an objectively all-powerful and good God. You don't have to believe in anything to be able to tell that those two statements seem mutually exclusive.
If you deny the existence of God, and I want to go down that route because I spent a lot of time in Russia, and for many of my Russian friends, Dostoevsky was almost a prophet when he pointed out, if God doesn't exist, everything is permissible. He didn't mean that atheists couldn't behave well. Of course they can. What he meant was there's no rational justification for morality if there's no God.
Okay, I'm going to stop him right there. There is no justification for objective morality if there's no God. There is plenty of justification for just morality or subjective morality, even if there's no God, right? But I assume that in his definition, morality itself is just, objective. So I'm not saying that he's saying anything wrong there, but just so that we're clear, I don't have to believe in God to say that you are a bad person for doing something, because I can say that that's my opinion, right? It's like taste. If I eat ice cream and I like it, I'm going to say this is a good ice cream. Does that mean that everybody has to agree that this ice cream is good and it's objective and I'm the right one and everybody else is wrong? No, like I'm just saying, in my perspective, in my experience, this ice cream is good. I can say that. None of the things that he claimed there is the problem of atheists. It's the materialistic nihilists problem. Does that make sense? Because atheism just means a lack of a belief in God. It doesn't mean believing that the world is purely materialistic. It doesn't mean being Richard Dawkins. It doesn't mean there is no good or evil in the world. It doesn't mean any of those things. It just means I don't believe in God.
And of course, what does it solve? The one thing it doesn't solve is the pain or the evil still there.
Well, does believing in Christianity solve the evil? Does that take away the suffering that people face each day? I mean, Job was in a lot of pain.
We've all asked the question, surely if there's a good God who's all powerful, there'd be no evil. So he can't be good or he can't be perfect. You've all heard that, haven't you? And you've all spent hours like I did as a student going through the night. Surely a good God would, could, might, should, all this kind of thing. Have any of you ever come to a satisfactory conclusion after that? No. Not one. I've never met one. I'm a pure mathematician, and one of the few things I've learned from that is, if you can't solve one question, change the question.
Or maybe you're wrong. Maybe. Maybe you don't know the answer to the question.
So here's my question. Is there any evidence anywhere in the universe that there's a God that you could trust with it? Now that's a big question, ladies and gentlemen. I believe there is. The claim is that the man on the cross was God incarnate. If he was, it raises a very deep question. What's God doing on a cross? At least that tells us that God has not remained distant from human suffering, but has himself become part of it. That's a window, ladies and gentlemen. That's a window, but it opens. Because if that were the end of the story, there'd be nothing more to be said. But the resurrection now tells us that death is not the end.
I want to say a few things. He's a very good speaker. He's a very charismatic speaker, but he's not really answering the question here. Okay, so basically what he says is like, God obviously isn't indifferent about the suffering because he came down to earth and then took the cross. So that's the proof that God isn't indifferent about us. But the claim still stands. Like, if there is a God who is not indifferent about our suffering, why doesn't he just end it like this? Why doesn't he do that? That's the question. So let's go to the next clip. It's by William Lane Craig, who I believe to be one of the best at debating these type of things out of all the Christian apologists that I've seen.
What do you think about Epicurus' argument that if God is omnibenevolent, omniscient, and omnipotent, if he knows about kids in Africa and that are born with AIDS, what do you think about him suggesting, him not intervening and him not changing that fact? That's a question that I've always struggled with. So I'm just wondering, could you expand on that, and I'd also like your input on it?
The problem of evil and suffering has been greatly discussed by philosophers, and I think there's been genuine progress made in this century on this problem. I think it's important to distinguish between the intellectual problem of suffering and the emotional problem of suffering, because these are quite different from each other. In terms of the intellectual problem of suffering, I think that you need to ask yourself, is the atheist claiming, as Epicurus did, that the existence of God is logically incompatible with the evil and suffering in the world? If that's what the atheist is claiming, then he's got to be presupposing some kind of hidden assumptions that would bring out that contradiction and make it explicit, because these statements are not explicitly contradictory. The problem is no philosopher in the history of the world has ever been able to identify what those hidden assumptions would be that would bring out the contradiction and make it explicit. On the contrary, you can actually prove that these are logically compatible with each other by adding a third proposition, namely, that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil in the world. As long as that statement is even possibly true, it proves that there's no logical incompatibility between God and the suffering in the world.
I think that's a great argument, honestly. And that's right. If he has a good reason to let babies in Africa be born with AIDS, if he has a great reason for that, sure. But I would actually say this, right? If he has a reason, that means he has a purpose, right? So then all these suffering and all these pain is collateral, okay? It's unintended consequence in his pursuit of something greater. But here's the thing. If he is omnipotent, why does he have to suffer a collateral? Meaning that whatever purpose he might have, why can he just achieve that purpose without all the suffering? I mean, he's literally omnipotent. He can do whatever he wants to. They say you can't have the cake and eat it too. But if you're God, if you're omnipotent, then obviously you can eat the cake too. You can fulfill any kind of purpose there, anything that you want to fulfill. And on top of that, you can also eliminate all the suffering in the world. If you're God, that's logical, okay? And maybe you're going to say, well, but that's not beautiful. That's not, triumphant. That's not as valuable. Okay, so then do this and make that as valuable. Make that just as valuable as the one with suffering. You know what I mean?
So the atheist would have to show that it is logically impossible for God to have morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil and suffering in the world, and no atheist has ever been able to do that. So,
Okay, no atheist has ever been able to do that, so let me have a crack at it, right? God cannot have a morally sufficient reason to permit all this suffering because he can just end it like this and still do everything else that he wants to do, right? Still have everything else he wants to come true. That's what being omnipotent means. So that is why I believe personally that it's logically impossible for God to have a sufficient excuse not to just do that.
the logical version of this problem, I think, is widely recognized to have failed. Those atheists who still press the problem, therefore press it as a probabilistic argument. They try to say that given the evil in the world, it's improbable that God exists. Not impossible, but improbable. Well, again, the difficulty there is that the atheist has to claim that if God did exist, then it is improbable that he would permit the evil and suffering in the world. And how could the atheist possibly know that?
Here's how I know it. It's because you guys claim that he's omnibenevolent. You guys claim that he's a super good guy. Okay? Now, if you show me a super good guy letting a dog attack a child, then I'm not going to be like, well, he probably has good reason. It's like, for example, let's talk about you, right? The person who's watching this video right now, right? I can assume that probably you're a guy because I make a lot of videos and stuff that guys are more likely to be into. And you can be like, how can you make that claim that the viewer is probably a male? You don't even know their name. You don't even know, anything about this person. It's like, yeah, like, yes, that's why it's a guess. That's what probability is. It's a guess, right? I don't know. I don't know what God is like, right? I don't know how the universe was created, but from what I can gather from the evidences that I personally see, I can say that I think there's a low probability because that's what probability is.
How could the atheist know that God would not, if he existed, permit the evil and suffering in the world? Maybe he's got good reasons for it. Maybe, like in Christian theism, God's purpose for human history is to bring the maximum number of people freely into his kingdom to find salvation and eternal life. And how do we know that that wouldn't require a world that is simply suffused with natural and moral suffering? It might be that only in a world like that, the maximal number of people would freely come to know God and find salvation. So the atheist would have to show that there is a possible world that's feasible for God, which God could have created, that would have just as much salvation and eternal life and knowledge of God as the actual world, but with less suffering. And how could the atheist prove such a thing? It's sheer speculation.
I agree with him in that we cannot prove such a thing, but God would be able to. I mean, God would be able to reduce suffering in any situation. I mean, that's what being omnipotent means. Okay? It doesn't mean that he's super strong. It means that he can literally do anything he wants to. Okay? That's what being omnipotent means. And if you're going to say that in this world, it's not possible to have a system that brings about more people freely to salvation than this one, but God is the guy that does the impossible. I mean, literally. Why not just change the way that the world is, right? Why not change the rules of logic in order for that to happen? And even if we're not saying all that stuff, think about this, right? If you're born in America, you are much, 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 much more likely to be Christian than if you were born in India. Okay? So, if what God is trying to do is bring the maximum number of people to salvation, maybe he should do something about India there. Because now you can't even make an argument that it's impossible to increase the number of people coming to salvation in this place because there's America where that is true. The number of people coming to salvation is more in America than in India.
I think ultimately Christian theism can make sense out of the suffering and evil in the world.
So basically, the biggest thing that I want to say is that if God is omnipotent, he doesn't have to suffer any consequences that are not desired. Him being omniscient and omnipotent, meaning that every single thing about the world is exactly as he wants it to be. Exactly as he wants it to be. Not like he wants this, so he has to kind of do a little bit of this. You know, he doesn't really want to do it. It's like going to the gym. I don't want to go to the gym, but I want muscles, right? So I'm going to the gym. I'm permitting that suffering. But if I'm God, I can just do this and then grow muscle, okay? And maybe you're gonna say, well, but that's not beautiful. That's not, you know, triumphant. That's not as valuable. Okay, so then do this and make that as valuable. Make that just as valuable as like the one with suffering. You know what I mean? And I guess that's where we get into the question of piety, you know, like, you know, does morality come before God or God before morality, blah, blah, blah. And I guess you can make a pretty decent argument with that. But the idea is still true. Just look at India, man. Just look at India. Afghanistan or North Korea. Statistically, there's way less people finding salvation in those specific countries than in America. Okay? So you can't say that the setup right now is optimal for maximal number of people finding free salvation because there's North Korea. Okay, why not just do something about North Korea, right? That'll optimize it even further, wouldn't it? Because there's basically nobody that's Christian in North Korea because if you know, it's illegal to sell the book. That's basically my point of view. You know, like, again, if you have anything to say to that, or if there's any specific videos you'd like to see me react to, just put it in the comments.